Hey guys, I'm Christina with All Mom Does, and I'm here in my kitchen today, and I want to talk with you a little bit about feeding your baby beef as one of their first foods. Now, if you're like many parents, you're probably thinking of starting your baby off by having avocado or banana or other types of, pureed fruits and vegetables, just because that's kind of the way it's always been done. However, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Dietary Guidelines for Americans both state that nutrient-dense foods like beef are absolutely appropriate for infants as long as they are prepared properly for their appropriate feeding stage. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So one of the reasons that you probably want to consider beef is because it is really nutrient dense. So it's got iron and zinc and choline, and all of those are necessary for your baby's healthy brain development. And one thing that it's also really important to know is that by the time a baby is 6 months old, they have exhausted their iron stores in their body from birth. And actually, this is especially important for breastfed babies. They cannot get all of the iron they need for their brain to develop simply from breastfeeding. So formula-fed babies usually have iron fortified formula, so they are getting the iron, but it's just not transferred through breast milk the same way. So it's especially important if you're breastfeeding that you make sure that the solid foods that you start your baby on are rich in iron, and beef is one of the biggest bangs for your buck. So there's also been research done on the progression of foods, just because it's so common for parents to start with, fruits and veggies and then progress onto things like beef and other meats, but actually there's no nutritional or physical benefit to doing it that way. So really the only reason that we do that is because we think that that's the way it's supposed to be done. Maybe we're not sure of how to properly prepare beef, and frankly, because the baby food companies don't make those little jars of meat for infants. So it's really important that your baby get great nutrition at this stage. So when your baby is first starting solid foods, which is about 4 to 6 months, you'll always want to talk to your doctor to make sure that's appropriate for your baby. And if you have any questions, always ask your doctor. But the general guideline is 4 to 6 months when you would start introducing solid foods. And for a baby, it's a whole sensory experience. So they are touching the food, they are tasting the food, they are seeing different colors in the food. So a lot of it is not going to go into their mouths, and that's okay, because at this stage, their primary nutrition is still coming from breast milk or formula. So solid foods are considered complementary, but that doesn't mean they're unnecessary. And so what that means, though, is that for the teeny bits that they are getting in their mouth, that you want the biggest bang for their buck. Which means every bite needs to have the best nutrition. And so beef provides some really great nutrition for your baby, which is why you should consider it as one of their first foods. Now let's talk a little bit about how to properly prepare it for your baby, because you're just not going to give them a hunk of steak, right? That's not safe. So we still have to make sure that it's appropriately prepared for your baby. When you're first starting to feed your baby, you do want to be looking out for allergic reactions. It's also a good idea not to introduce a ton of new flavors at once, because it'll overwhelm them. So just like if you were starting with fruits or vegetables, if you start with beef, you're just going to be doing single ingredient purees. So you'll be starting with single ingredient purees. And what that means is one ingredient pureed with water to make it the consistency that's appropriate for your baby. And so when they are just learning how to eat, they're learning how to move food with their tongue from the front of the mouth to the back of their mouth, and how to swallow solid foods. Your purees are going to be pretty runny, and they might not look the best for you, but that's okay. It's still appropriate for your baby. As your baby progresses, you can move on to little chunks that they can self-feed. And then as they get older and they can tolerate more foods, and you're confident that you're not risking any allergic reactions, really they can be eating whatever you're eating. You just need to make sure that it's chopped into small pieces or mashed or shredded. So I'm going to show you right now how we can take some of our typical table foods that contain beef and make it appropriate for your baby. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is pureeing foods. And what I have here is we just have some ground beef that's just been browned up. And nothing's been added to it yet because the baby's just learning how to eat, and so we don't want to overwhelm them with too many flavors. So we're going to puree this, but I want to show you as they get older, even just this ground beef, I mean, they can pick this up and eat this with their fingers during the later feeding stage. So that would be super easy. You know, as your baby's getting older for taco night, they can just have some of your taco crumbles. So you don't need to really do much special. So right now, this is just plain ground beef that has been browned, unseasoned, and I do have a baby food maker. So there are tons of options on the market. So they're pretty handy. They usually come with some storage containers so you can make kind of a bulk amount of foods and then put them in the freezer for use later. So it's really easy to make individual servings. So they're convenient that way. There are even some upscale ones that cook the food for you and they steam it, including beef and other meats. But you actually don't need this. So these are handy, but if you don't have one, if you don't want to buy one, if you don't want to have to find cupboard space for one, you don't need it. So if you look behind me here on the counter, I have a bunch of things that you can use to make baby food. So there's really no special items required, and I'm confident that you have something in your kitchen that you can use. So I have a mini chopper, that's, just a mini food processor to, grind and puree. Those are pretty inexpensive. Just a typical food processor works well for bigger batch things. A blender works great because you're just adding water to things. And so when you make it thin enough, it's going to blend it right up. We also have an Instant Pot and a slow cooker. And those are great for, for making things that are really tender, that can shred easily. And so your baby's going to be able to eat those later on in the feeding stages. So today I'm going to make a meat puree for you. And I'm not going to use the baby food maker. We're going to use the mini chopper. Okay, so we're going to use this mini chopper. It's super easy. So what you're just going to do is you're just going to take some of the beef crumbles, add some water. So you can adjust the consistency based on your baby's feeding stage. So if they are just learning how to eat, you're going to want it to be pretty thin and watery. If they have kind of nailed that initial puree and then are just kind of learning how to eat thicker foods, you can make it a little thicker. So it really is based on, how far into solid foods you are with your baby. But this is a great first food and totally appropriate as long as it's prepared properly. And I know that doesn't look terribly appetizing to you as an adult, but for your baby, it's a great way to introduce them to the flavor of beef. And then as they grow, you can start adding more things to it. So that's 2 ways to feed your baby beef. So we've got the ground and we've got the pureed. So introduce with puree, move on to the ground if they're a self-feeder. And then here, I actually have a grilled up piece of flank steak. And of course, you're not gonna put this on your baby's plate. That would be a choking hazard and not appropriate. But, the rest of your family is having this for dinner. You can give it to your baby as well, as long as they are starting to eat bigger chunks of food. It's a myth that your baby needs teeth in order to eat. So if you think about it, the teeth that they get initially are the front teeth anyway. They don't get molars until much later. And so even when they're eating those little Cheerios or their puffs, they're chewing on their gums. And so they don't actually need teeth to eat. So don't worry about that, but just make sure that the foods that you're feeding them are tender so they're not going to choke, and make sure they're cut into small enough pieces so that they can eat them safely. Now, one thing you can do with this, because as I lift it up, you can see all these juices in there, right? So you always need to make sure that your beef is cooked to the proper temperature. According to the FDA, ground beef needs to be cooked to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and then beef roasts and steaks need to be 145. And so obviously you're not going to give your baby this big hunk of meat. That would not be safe. But those juices have a lot of the vitamins and the micronutrients that they need. So the iron, zinc, and choline. So if you have an early eater that even can't eat chunks of foods yet, you can actually take a chunk of this and put it in one of those mesh feeders, you know, that you use for like teething. You can put frozen fruit in there and they just kind of suck on them and they never actually get chunks of food and they just get all the juices out. If you are confident that your beef is cooked to the proper temperature, you can actually put a hunk of beef in one of those and they can get the nutrients from there. But if you're ready, if your baby is ready for actual real food, let me show you how we can do this one. So here we can just cut our beef into teeny tiny bite-sized pieces for baby's little mouth. And these, as I feel them, I mean, they're tender enough that the baby can mash them in their mouth as they eat. So this is a great way to serve, you know, if your family is having steak or something else delicious, go ahead and feed that to your baby. Okay, I have one more thing to show you. So back here in this Instant Pot, I actually made a roast earlier. So here, we can take out this hunk of beef and we can actually shred this portion. It's nice and tender. So it's nice and tender for the baby. And these shreds, if you look at them, I mean, they're perfectly sized and really tender. And then the family will just eat the rest of this roast, right? But also in here, we also have some carrots and we have some baby potatoes. And so the family is getting this whole meal and the baby can absolutely eat this too. So depending on, you know, the feeding stage of your baby, you can, you know, chop these into small little pieces, or, you know, if it's better, you know, to mash them up, you can mash these up into, you know, more of a puree, stick them in the blender. And then same with the potatoes. You know, this is flavorful and so easy to feed to your baby. So beef is absolutely an appropriate food for your baby. You just need to make sure that you're preparing it in a way that's safe. So there really isn't any need to wait. There's not a, you know, a magic time when your baby moves from fruits and veggies to meat. It can actually be their very first food if you choose. The medical community agrees. There's really no medical reason why babies can't have meat. I think it's just our own hesitancy that it doesn't seem as easy to puree. So there you have it. We have 4 ways to feed beef to your baby, a 5th way if you consider the little tip with the mesh feeder. Thank you to the Washington State Beef Commission for sponsoring this video. And don't forget to like us on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube. Find more information on allmomdoes.com.